If you're new to my channel, I talk about books, blurbs and blogs. Simple as that. Today we are going to be talking about Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. It's quite the journey reading this book, and I'm going to tell you more about it. So this book starts on a dark winter's night in an ancient inn called the Swan. The regulars at the inn are telling stories. It's on this one particular night. The door swings open. There's a wounded gentleman with a girl in his arms, or at least what appears to be either a doll or a girl. The girl looks like she's dead, and hours later, the girl somehow, mysteriously, comes alive. And the questions start to arise with the locals. Was this a magical event, or is this a scientific event? And they seek to determine which one that is. Some of the locals want to find the answers. They want to know who she is, where she comes from, how did she awake from the dead? How was that even possible? Who does she belong to? Nobody seems to know. But everybody, for some weird reason, they latch onto her and they want to take her. As the plot builds and it moves along, you find that there are three families who have lost children at some point in their time, who are all girls and all look, for some reason, very similar to this child who's suddenly awakened from the dead. They're all drawn to it. Even those that don't have children are drawn to her, and they all want to claim her to be their own for some reason. And just to add to the story, the child is mute, so she can't speak to anybody and explain what happened and who she is. The novel is a little bit like The River. It's a deep dive, meandering story that starts off about the injured man and the doll-like, childlike figure that enters into the inn, and then it starts to evolve into the characters and the families who are drawn to this child and want this child to be theirs. And some of them go into who do some research and figure out if the child actually belongs to them, and some of them just want this child. So it's a little bit of a, to me, it's a little bit of a strange story in that you're not sure if it's a mystery or if it's a fantasy, or to me it was just very vague in where this plot was going with the story. It was almost as if it didn't know if it should be magical, scientific, or a mystery story. I don't know, but it wasn't very clear as the story went along. And I did find the story to be slow at the start, so I was reading probably 1 or 2 chapters at a time just to get into the story. And then it got to a point where I just couldn't put the book down. And then it got to a point where I could put the book down and leave it for a few days and pick it up again. And I was quite relieved to get to the very end, because I didn't think that this story was kind of going to end. It just kept going and going and going. And because of that, that didn't sit well with me. I don't like these stories that keep going and going and keep leading and leading into these, I guess, different directions. It wasn't even a different direction. It just kind of kept the story, like I said, meandering. And I didn't feel like it was going anywhere at one point. It was just going. And it was almost like it's a book about storytellers telling their stories, and now they had a new story to tell. And I felt that the author was telling her own story of storytelling. So it was, to me, it was a well-written book. The prose were awesome. They were excellent. They did get you to a point where you just couldn't put the book down, and then it just kind of, it tailed off again. It was a bit weird. I don't know if that was intentional from the author. I mean, maybe it was. It's based on the River Thames, a meandering River Thames that goes off on tangents. Then it pulls you back in again, and then it takes you out again. So maybe it wasn't intentional. And if that was the case from the author, she did an excellent job, and the storytelling was excellent. But this book wasn't the book I was expecting, and I know a lot of people were raving about this book when it first came out, and I'm left with thinking, really? What's all the hype about? Sadly. Not that it's going to deter me from her novels, because I actually think her writing is excellent and I really enjoyed sections of this book. But it did leave me wanting to get to the end, possibly for all the wrong reasons. Like, I wanted to get to the end because I just wanted to get the book over and done with. And the other reason was I wanted to find the answers. And when I did find the answers, which she does eventually get to, it almost fizzled out. The excitement of the book just fizzled. So that for me was a little bit disappointing. And there was also some characters in this book who I really felt invested in, and then there was others who was like, I just did not invest in them at all. But there were some really strong characters in this story that I wanted to hear more from, which she does do, but I would have liked it to have been expanded more on those particular characters, because I thought they were really strong characters in the story. But there were a lot of people in this book. Not the most I've ever read, but because I was putting the book down often and not returning to it straight away, I did forget some of the characters and who they were and whereabouts in the plot they were, and then it would get reminded. So she does remind you about who the characters are, just because it is in some ways quite a long-winded story in my mind. And what really irked me about this story was you were still left at the end of the story wondering, was this real? Was it scientific based? Or was it magical? Is it both? And perhaps again that was the intention of the author. And because I'm not into my fantasy and magical stories per se, that annoyed me a little bit. I wanted it to be one or the other, but kind of left it open-ended. For me, I think for some people it was great and it was the best ending, and maybe it was the best storyline they've ever read. But for me, I didn't like that because it didn't settle well in my mind, and I kind of like a clear ending. Maybe it's done deliberately so that it opens it up for a second book and create this as a series. I don't know. I don't think so, but that's how I felt with this. I think it left you with a bit more and wanting a bit more of an answer. My takeaway from this book, I would say I would give this a 3 out of 5, just because of the type of stories I like, and this wasn't a story that I loved by any means. The hype of this book was a little bit overrated personally. I am glad that I only bought this in the sale and not paid the full amount for this book. I think if I'd paid the full amount for this book, maybe, I don't know, probably 35, yeah, it would have been around 35 Canadian dollars, about $30 US. I think I would have been annoyed if I paid full price for this book. But that's why I didn't read it when it was new, because I knew this sort of storyline isn't necessarily my thing, but I think it's other people's things. And I think if you're kind of like a mystery come fantasy come storytelling and excellent writing, I think you'll enjoy this. And I think for people who are not big into fantasy stories but like the realistic side of it too, I think you might enjoy this book, just because it's very different from many of the stories that are out there today. But I will be reading her 13th Tale. I actually have that book on my shelf here, so that will be something I will read. I've heard the 13th Tale is way better, and it's one of her earlier books as well. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to click subscribe and like and share and even comment. Love to know your thoughts, what you think about it. Was it your cup of tea? Was it not your cup of tea? How did you view this book? All those sorts of wonderful questions you get on BookTube. Hopefully I will see you next time. Bye for now.